Hi there, and welcome back to part 2 in my series on making fire. This week we're going to be looking at man-made tinders. So in last week's episode we had a look at some natural tinders. We looked at birch bark and fat wood and seed heads from the thistle plants, amongst some others. This week we're going to be looking at tinders which are either completely man-made or tinders that have been improved by man to make them work better as a tinder. I apologise if my voice sounds a bit croaky in this video. I've got a stinking cold at the moment which I'm trying to get rid of. But it's probably making my voice sound a little bit weird, so bear with me. Anyway, enough about me. Let's get on to making fire. So just as with the previous video on natural tinders, this is by no means an exhaustive list of man-made tinders that you can use. These are just tinders that I've used, or I do use, that I have enjoyed using or I've had particular success with. You know, you're always going to come up with things that you go back to because they work well. Well, that's very much the case here. So first up are these paper firelighters. I'm a big fan of these. You may have seen me using these in previous videos. They're basically a card which has been impregnated with wax. And it's really thin. It's the other thing I like about it, and it's in card form. It's rigid sheets, and because they're thin they pack away into a pocket, or I often keep a couple of sheets of this in the pouch that my stove goes in, and then they're always at hand. Okay, so that stuff is really good. So if you tear off a piece of this waxed card and then prise it apart like this, okay, so you end up with two pieces. You can then take your knife and just fluff up those fibres till you've got a nice little pile of them. Like this. And that takes a spark really well. So next up are these. I make these myself out of cotton wool pads, the type used for removing makeup. And basically you just grab a cotton wool pad and you dip it in wax, into hot wax, which you've heated up. And the wax then dries and hardens, and you end up with a really good firelighter. A little bit like the waxed paper or card one that I showed you a minute ago. It's very, very similar, works in a very similar way, and you've got a little bit of the cotton wool exposed which isn't in the wax, which will take your spark. Right, next up is a tinder which you can collect at home out of your tumble dryer if you have one. And it's basically just the lint which comes out of the filter in your tumble dryer. I collect this stuff. I'm a carpenter by trade, so often when my clothing goes through the washing machine and tumble dryer, there's bits of shavings of wood and all sorts in there, as well as fibres from clothing. And that stuff, a little bit like cotton wool or like the downy seed heads that we looked at last week, that stuff catches a spark really, really easily. It doesn't burn quite as quickly as the seed heads, so you do have a little bit longer to get your secondary material on, which is quite good. Okay, next up we have jute twine or jute string. You can buy this often from garden centres, and this stuff's really useful. It's very cheap to buy, doesn't take up a lot of room in your tinder kit, and what you need to do is you need to tease apart the fibres and try and open them up so that you have the individual strands like this. And that stuff will take a spark. But what you can also do with this is you can make it into a tinder bundle. So if you're using either the fungus that we looked at last week, the cramp ball fungus, or if you're using char-cloth, you can transfer your ember into a nest made of this stuff and blow that into flame quite nicely. Okay, next up is magnesium. Magnesium is a metal which is flammable, which is odd, I know, but it does work. You can buy these in blocks like this one, which have a ferrocerium rod on one side, so you can scrape off the magnesium and then strike it with your ferro rod that's already attached to it. Or you can buy these in tubes. Sorry, not in tubes, in rods. A little bit like a large ferro rod. So what you need to do is just scrape. I like to use the back of my knife until you've got a little pile of shavings like this, and then you could ignite that with your ferro rod. Okay, next up we have char-cloth. Now char-cloth is an amazing stuff which again you can make. So to make char-cloth, you simply cut up pieces of cotton. I use denim because it's 100% cotton. It's very important that there are no other synthetic fibres mixed in with the cotton. It has to be 100% cotton. Cut it into squares and pack them into a tin, not too tightly, but you don't want to have big gaps in there either. The lid of the tin needs to be quite close fitting, and you need to have a hole in the top of the lid to let the smoke out as the char-cloth is cooking, and then you simply place that tin over a heat source, be that an open fire or a camp stove or something like that. I wouldn't do it in the kitchen, it does put out a lot of smoke, and basically you're going to watch that smoke, and when the smoke stops coming out of the hole in the top of the tin, carefully take the tin off the heat. Don't open it. If you open it, it'll combust. And that just wants to cool down in the tin, and when you open the tin you will have char-cloth. So the beautiful thing about char-cloth is it'll take a spark really easily, even a relatively cool spark like you'd get from a traditional flint and steel. So you may have noticed that the man-made tinders often work better than the natural ones, and I guess they do, especially the waxy ones, the cotton wool pads and the waxed paper. They work really well, and they burn long as well. You could almost use them as a fuel in their own right. Certainly the waxed cotton wool, I'm sure you could burn those and just put a pot straight over the top of those, and that would bring water to the boil. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Don't forget to tune in to part 3, which will be all about ignition and different methods of igniting your fire. In the meantime, take care, and thanks for watching.